Good day. On behalf of the Henry Luce Foundation and our hosts at the New York Historical Society, I welcome you to the Conversations on American Art and Museums, a celebration of the Luce American Art Program's 40th anniversary. Since its founding in 1982, the American Art Program has provided support totaling $215 million to 500 museums in all 50 states. It continues to award approximately $7.5 million annually for innovative museum projects in the visual arts. Through this work, Luce seeks to advance the role of visual arts in an open and equitable society and the potential for museums to serve as public forums for art-centered conversations that celebrate creativity, explore difference, and see common ground. With an eye toward the future and the best possible future for art museums, these conversations will explore the capacity of art museums to challenge accepted histories and advance the dialogues in which we need to engage with diverse collaborators and communities. And let me add these additional few remarks of introduction before I'm joined by my fellow panelists. It's two or three quotations that I want all of us to keep in mind as we address this topic today. The first was a quotation very familiar to me, uttered by the Secretary of the Smithsonian at the time I was appointed the founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian. The words belong to Secretary of the Smithsonian, Robert McCormick Adams, and here is what he had to say about the National Museum of the American Indian itself. This is a national museum that takes the permanence, the authenticity, the vitality, and the self-determination of Native American voices as the fundamental reality it must represent. We move decisively from the older image of the museum as a temple with its superior self-governing priesthood to a forum committed not to the promulgation of received wisdom, but to the encouragement of a multicultural dialogue. And indeed, our conversation today will begin with talking about Native collections and Native interpretation, because in a respect, I think those museums have been the training ground for much of what is quite current in museology and museum practice and comes under the heading of decolonizing the museum. What we want to do is to try to determine the substance and the real grit of what it means to decolonize a museum. And these additional quotations to keep in mind, if you will. The first is one from Rick Hill, an artist, former director of the Museum of Contemporary Native Art at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, and former member of the senior staff of the National Museum of the American Indian. He puts the matter this way: the main difference between Indian and non-Indian artists is that we are still community-driven. Art is the cement that binds the Indian people together, uniting us with our ancestors and with generations yet to be born. Through art, we can take a look at why language is important, why ritual is important, and why land remains so central in language to us. And with his characteristic candor and truth-telling, Bob Houses, another very distinguished contemporary Native artist, has this characterization regarding the essential nature of Native art and his role as an artist. Said Bob, "I want to see people participating in my work. That's totally contrary to what we're taught in America, the artist as an individual, the genius. I don't want to see that in my work at all. I'd rather see at the most a cultural reflection of being Apache. I've been fighting these concepts of individualism, uniqueness, and universalism, concepts that are totally contrary to tribalism and Native communities. Individualism denies a future or a past awareness. You claim it, you own it, but you're not a part of it." So keep these words in mind as we now proceed, and as I am joined by my fellow panelists, Amy Scott and Kevin Gover. I think that you know a little bit about all of us, because you have been given biographical information. As I pointed out, I was the founding director and director emeritus, and am the founding director and director emeritus of the National Museum of the American Indian, and the president and CEO emeritus of the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles. Amy is currently a vice president of the Autry Museum of the American West, and Kevin has now moved on from his position as a director and my successor at the National Museum of the American Indian, and is now an undersecretary for museums and culture of the Smithsonian Institution. And Kevin and I represent something of a twofer, if you will. We are both native lawyers, cum museum directors and directors of the National Museum of the American Indian, and both happen to be from native communities in what is now the state of Oklahoma. But welcome to Amy and Kevin, and they should be joining us, and we will see them on the screen. I see Amy now, and I assume Kevin is coming shortly behind. What we would like to do is this, if we may, today. And I've already talked with Amy and Kevin about this particular approach. I am one who believes that museums that handle native collections and do native programming have had a great deal to do with what has happened in museology and museum practice in the 21st century, coming out of the 20th century. And so I want to focus there in a way as we try to uncover exactly what Secretary Adams, Bob Houses, and other artists have been saying about native art. But then I want to take a measure a little bit further in our conversation of the impact of all of this on the rest of the museum community in the United States and elsewhere, even globally. So we will embark on that journey if we may. But Kevin, let me begin with you, if I may. You've heard those words spoken by Bob Adams before. There was great substance to them, and they were honestly slightly striking, coming out of the mouth of one of the most distinguished anthropologists the Smithsonian Institution has ever seen on its staff, let alone as the secretary of the entire institution. Tell me what you found in your journey in content that actually comes from those words. And I guess the first thing I would focus on is this concept of first-person voice and what that meant, what you found when you succeeded me. We're probably trying to clean up some of what founding directors in their rampant entrepreneurial spirit actually do, and making the NMAI an institution for the future. But just talk to us a little bit about that and what your experience was and how you found it, how it evolved, and how it tells the story of the character of the NMAI.
Well, thanks, Rick, and good afternoon, everyone. So obviously we were building very much on the work that you did, that Rick Hill did, that the other senior staff at the beginning of the museum had done. And so the intellectual groundwork was well laid by the time I got there. It was a way of life for the museum that we honor the first person voice, that we felt an obligation when dealing with a particular culture or a particular history to work with the communities whose culture or history we were representing. And it took a great many forms. But what was most interesting about the whole thing to me was that it took me a while to sort of understand that this represented really a transfer of authority, or at least a sharing of authority between the museum experts, such as they were, and the community experts who were every bit as capable and knowledgeable as our museum experts. And what resulted was not so much a loss of power from the museum, but rather a very mutual exchange of knowledge between the communities and the museum that was really enriching in both directions. And by sharing authority, by working with the community I believe we both were made better, and I'm quite certain that the presentations that the museum made were made better.
Mhm. Tell me, Kevin, if you will, in this shifting that you're talking about, or this transfer of authority, uh, give me your reflections, if you will, on the repatriation legislation, which of course was part of the creation of the National Museum of the American Indian. It was very ironic to me that those two pieces of substance were the very same piece of legislation. And I remember being confronted by lots of folks, some of them in a reasonably unfriendly manner, saying, well, why are you creating an institution when you're basically handing the collections or parts of them back to the Native communities themselves? And I remember I had to give, I think within less than a year after I'd become the director, presentation at the AAM on the subject of repatriation. It was a room that was set up for 50 people, and about 300 showed up. And you could have dropped a pin in the room and it would have sounded like a bomb, because the subject raised such anxieties in the community. But give me your reflections on how that ties back to some of what you're saying, and even what it may have meant in broader implications in this power shift that you're talking about.
So our museum and the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian were compelled to conduct the sharing of authority I was talking about, actually creating a right in the Native communities to the return of certain categories of items, and initially, most particularly, human remains. And well, the great fear in the museum community, which had begun to fade by the time I became director, but the great fear initially was that the tribes were going to back up the U-Haul to the museum and take all the stuff away, right?
Yeah.
And that's not what happened at all. We found that the tribes were remarkably principled in determining which things they believed were subject to repatriation, and being perfectly willing to leave those that were not. And as I said, so what resulted through the repatriation work and working together to try to understand what these things were, what their provenance was, how they came into the possession of the museum, what they represented to the community, was just extraordinarily enriching for the museum. Helped us understand better the things that we had. And by the way, it wasn't just the repatriation material. They would look at the entirety of the collection and look at the catalog cards, and many times would say, "Oh, that's just wrong. You know, that's not what that is." And some of them were actually fairly hilarious, or they were things that weren't from that particular tribe. So they were teaching us about the collection. But the important thing is that experience then is being had by more and more museums across the country that have Native American materials. But it also has made much of the museum community very comfortable with this idea of shared stewardship of collections, and indeed returns, whether compelled by law or not, but just because ethically it's the right thing to do. And so the example set by the NMAI and other museums that were engaged in repatriation has spread. My colleagues at the Smithsonian, when I first arrived, my fellow directors would have had no interest in this idea of ethical returns or shared stewardship. But now the directors at the Smithsonian, at least, are entirely on board with this idea. And it's because they took great comfort in the experience that the National Museum of the American Indian and the National Museum of Natural History had under the repatriation laws.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the point is really that the invocation of native or first-person voice comes in several different forms, and we'll try to explore different aspects of it this morning or today. But it is interesting. I do remember one of the very first visits, speaking of these things, up in New York before the collections were moved down to Washington, D.C. for the most part. When a number of caciques, Hopi caciques, were visiting and looking at the Katsina collection. And I remember walking down the aisle and all of a sudden, and being trailed by a number of the conservators of the museum. And all of a sudden I heard this gasp, and it was almost as bodies were dropping behind me, because the caciques, as they felt was only appropriate, were casting corn pollen, toward the Katsinas, which is part of the ritual care, if you will, of that. And yet, years later, even before I left the NMAI, our conservators, under the very able leadership of the sort of founding head of conservation at the NMAI, were actually compiling volumes of books about what Native people themselves could tell us about how these pieces, how these objects, how these cultural objects, these living objects should be cared for. So I think that it represented a very profound shift on multiple fronts, I think. Now, if I may, there are many things more that we could talk about the NMAI specifically, but I would like to pull Amy into this conversation, because she and I had a varying kind of experience, and I did, quite frankly, going from the NMAI to the Autry. The Autry being an encyclopedic museum by some definition, representing multiple cultural communities. But Amy, tell us a little bit about, and then we will circle back to some related topics, about your experience on this particular issue, namely the invocation of Native voice and the place of Native voice, its authenticity, its authoritativeness, etc., in some of our work and your work, which goes over a considerable period of time with Native communities at the Autry Museum of the American West.
Sure. And thank you, Rick, for inviting me to be here, and to the New York Historical Society for hosting this wonderful conversation, an important one. The Autry is a really sort of interesting case study, I think, in its relatively condensed and brief history. The museum opened in 1988, and about 15 years thereafter, of course, we merged with the Southwest Museum, which really, I think, became the first sort of critical paradigm shift in how we approach not only Native history, but Western history broadly. And it not only forced the museum to analyze its Native collections and collecting practices, but I think as importantly to analyze the non-Native collections as they sat in relation to the tremendously significant holdings of the Southwest Museum itself, of course, a very colonial institution from its foundings back in 1909. In the course of that, we were better able, I think, to see not only holes in the collection, but how the addition of Southwest materials to galleries that were not necessarily Native focused, but certainly art driven, created more dialogic models. And it really has been a process, not just of adding to the collections, primarily in terms of contemporary art, that helped build out and furthered the conversations in the historical materials into the present, and really sort of speaking back to a lot of long-held assumptions built into the foundings of colonial institutions like the Southwest, primarily, obviously, of Native culture being one that is dead or dying. But a leveling, I would say, of that dialogue. So when we had the chance the first opportunity really to redo the galleries at the Autry wholesale since the merger with the Southwest, it gave us the chance to sort of take the bird's eye view and to look across collections of Native and non-Native art alike, including art produced by Hispanic and Latin American artists, Asian artists, contemporary and historic, decorative arts, and to see sort of what some of the broader forces, I think, that has shaped these very diverse artistic practices and sort of modes of cultural production have been. And that resulted in a much more, as Rick, you always used to like to say, and I still like the term very much, horizontal approach, in which large scale works were given equal footing and voice and treatment and respect alongside alongside native and non-native works alike. So it really became, in many ways, a tripartite conversation between some of the major ethnic and cultural groups that have dominated the Western experience and shaped its contemporary art. So that was one, sort of leveling the playing field, I think, in a spatial and in a curatorial sense. The second, I think, which is still really an ongoing practice, is the increasing recognition by the curatorial staff of the voices and what is unique and important about this conversation, not necessarily about Native art itself, because as non-Native curators, I think our role is more of a supportive and a contextualizing one than a speaking for. It is a helping support and facilitate dialogues between different cultures and different types of artworks, rather than dictating or directing those conversations.
Mm-hmm. And Amy, let me interject something there, and I'd love to pull Kevin into it too. The quotations, which you and I have talked about for at length, of Rick Hill and Bob House's, of this sort of fundamentally different nature, which is relevant to definitions of art and to art museums who purport to interpret art objects in their collections, of that Bob and Rick seem to be talking about is a little bit different from at least my understanding, and you're the art historian, I am not, of how we look at art objects, this cultural dimension to it. And tell me what impact, and I'd love Kevin's reflections on it too, what impact this has on what you do in the interpretive process, or maybe even apart from programming or exhibitions that may go up in the museum, what this means with this invocation of the first person voice in what we do.
I think part of the answer to that, and I think there are multiple sort of ways in which you can step into that question. One of them, I think, might be not just the bringing in of Native curators and of Native communities, of course. It was into the curatorial process, not just sort of telling us what the work is about and correcting the files, although that is important. And certainly the Southwest Museum had many, many, many anachronisms and certainly just outright wrong information in it. And that process is ongoing. That's important. But actually bringing them into the selection and the curatorial process itself, artist-led and sort of community-led conversations in the selection of objects, the method of their display, and how it is that other forces within the museum, whether it's exhibition designers, educators, or programmers, can apply their unique skill sets to making those pieces and those voices heard. So it's a listening process, first and foremost, but that goes in a couple of different directions. I think another thing that is still an ongoing one is the need for non-Native curators to recognize the legitimacy and support and elevate the legitimacy of Native knowledge that's represented in many of these objects, not necessarily in opposition to Western science and notions of Western art, the individualism that Kevin and that Bob was referring to earlier, but the idea that this knowledge and these systems are as valid and as significant when it comes to the practices, modes of production, and cultural values that inform and are represented in the art objects themselves. And then the last sort of interesting thing that I've started, and this is a more sort of recent, I think, dawning awareness on my part, and it comes from working with more and more contemporary and just speaking with more and more contemporary Native artists, is the idea that in addition to sort of situating Native art in relationship and sort of historical and contextual relationships to non-Native art and the colonial histories and processes that Native art so often critiques, but is allowing a lot of contemporary Native art not only sort of demands we ask critical questions of colonial histories and of museums themselves, but of what was I going to say? It asks of ourselves as viewers, I think is what I was getting at. Not just of the objects, or of the institutions in which they're placed and their placement and how that goes together, but of ourselves and our own sort of standing vis-a-vis colonial histories and the institutions that have so long sort of upheld and supported and driven those histories. So there is a sort of a more, I think, introspective quality that a lot of contemporary Native art, asks, some more deeply and some more quietly.
Yeah, I think that's really quite true. I know that, both of you know that my dad was a Native artist and very much a part of the Oklahoma fine arts movement in the latter part of the 20th century. And I had a conversation one time with Tony Abeda, a very distinguished contemporary Native artist and friend to all three of us, about it. And he was pointing out that his dad, whom my dad knew very well, his dad being Narciso Abeda, were in an era when I think the beginning of the 20th century through the better part of the 20th century, what showed up in Native art was really this sometimes certainly pointed and intentional and almost desperate sometimes effort to preserve certain kinds of knowledge. And that's what sort of showed up in much of the art. And that now, according to Tony, and I think it's true, it shows up in his own art, there is this, there is a different cant, if you will. The art often reflects issues, sometimes environmental, sometimes social, that are of great importance to Native communities, apart from their status as an art object. And it is this kind of introspective reading of history, I think, that is reflected in that art. And that I think is what both Rick and Bob are talking about. Kevin, how has this sort of been reflected at all in the evolution of exhibits under your reign at the NMAI? I see this. I saw it in the treaty show in a way, in the Americans, but give us some examples of how that plays in both invoking the first person voice, juxtaposing it with other voices, how you handle that dialogical relationship in exhibitions, especially when sometimes there is truth on one side and not necessarily on the other, or is that the museum's business? Those kinds of questions.
Oh boy, that's a complicated question. I'll talk about Americans a little, and it's sort of interesting because when you start talking about first person voice, Americans is an odd exhibition in that sense because it's not really about Indians. It's about how Indians are perceived by white people. And so I have to admit, we did not engage white people as first person voices to tell us their understanding of Indians. But the exhibition was really about this curious role that Native Americans play in American culture, and that we might be caricatured, we might be ridiculed, but we also might be honored, and our endorsement, if you will, sought by major companies, major products, even the armed forces of the United States seeks Native naming rights for their various weapon system, and that's just the weirdest thing ever if you stop and think about it. But the rest of the story involved three iconic moments in American history: the Trail of Tears, the Battle of Little Bighorn, and Pocahontas. And we thought this is the way to meet people where they are. Everybody's heard of those things. They know something about them. Much of what they know probably isn't true. And here's our opportunity to teach them, but also get them to ask the question. This goes to Amy's point about, encouraging introspection by the visitors. Get them to think about, why didn't I know that? Or why did I know the story this other way? Why didn't I know the rest of this story? And we weren't there, to beat them over the head and say, you should have known this, because why should they know it? They've been taught, they only know what they've been taught, and they've been taught poorly. So we try to take the hand of the visitor and say, hey, us too, we don't get it, help us understand what all of this is about. And it proved to be very effective.
Right. Well, I'll say that takes me back to a conversation I once had with the current secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch, for her new work, Kevin, and who's again a friend of both of us, very much so. And that was, and Lonnie, as you may recall, Kevin, for a short time when he was in Chicago directing an institution and not at the Smithsonian himself, sat on the board of the NMAI. And he and I had conversations long into the night about the evolution of these institutions called ethnic-specific museums, and where they began and where they ended up. We know where they began. They began sort of out of all of the multicultural discussions that came out of the late 80s and the early 90s, as certain communities were doing their very best to say, you're missing us. We are also here in American society. We're part of this fabric. And the response in the Native community was to set up ethnic-specific museums. And certainly the NMAI was that in its beginnings. But Lonnie and I were talking about that question as he was beginning to think about what the African American Museum, which he eventually directed, was going to be doing. And in a way, what happened, I think, and what you see in the Americans, I believe, even at the NMAI, and what you hear from Lonnie, both in the museum he directed as well as the books he's written, is that the African American Museum is not simply a museum of African American history. It is a museum of American history. Same with the NMAI. It may have begun as an ethnic-specific museum, but it is really a museum of American history. And so somehow you have to set the frame so that it embraces that and becomes not only an internal exercise, obviously relevant to the Native community, for example, but becomes something else and connects across boundaries. And I think the Americans did that in a very important way.
Yeah, I think that's true. It also occurs to me that while it is true that these museums are not intended only for Native Americans, far from it, and not intended to isolate these cultures and these histories from the larger themes of the world, but they are accountable to those communities in a very interesting way, much like Bob Adams suggested in his speech. The NMAI has always been accountable to Indian country.
Correct.
And I think that's one of the mega trends in museum world right now is accountability, and how museums are going to be held more and more accountable to the museum, to the communities in which they reside, but also to the communities that are the sources of their collections. And that's a very interesting thing, and it's a bit ironic, but that really, maybe it didn't begin with the ethnic specific museums, but it was fully embraced by the NMAI, by the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and then proven that you can have that accountability to community and still do sound scholarship and still practice sound museum techniques and responsibilities.
Right. No, I agree. I remember very early on in my own tenure as the director of the NMAI, I distinguished and did so publicly, did so in speeches, between audiences of the museum, which were multiple and included non-Indians and Indians, natives, and constituents, which I consider to be a status and a role with an associated certain set of responsibilities on the part of the NMAI as an institution, was different from an audience. In other words, it was where the concept of accountability did kick in very strong ways. And I'm going to come to that in just a minute, if I may. But Amy, I would be interested in your perspective about how this all happens too, because I will tell you, and you know this from our previous conversations, Amy, that one of the reasons I sort of lurched out of retirement, which I was actually enjoying, and took the job at the Autry Museum of the American West, was because I consider the Autry Museum of the American West to be, at least in sort of historic form and substance, somewhat different from a multicultural museum per se, which lots of people would say the NMAI was, and the African American Museum was, even though, as Kevin and I have exchanged here, it really wasn't. It's something more than that. But the Autry was an effort really to embrace, using that good old reference word of ours, horizontal, an intercultural approach to history. And I think that in the end, that's probably what the African American Museum and the NMAI also attempt to do. But give me a sense of how you see that playing out and what the potentiality is. And you've already adverted to it a little bit in talking about Art of the West, you know, the core art museum, art gallery at the Autry that you oversaw, and how we assemble collections to do that. But just talk to us about how it works and what the potentialities are that are really quite appealing and positive of this kind of intercultural interpretation, invoking, again, first-person voices and trying to put all of that together.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Autry, you know, again, going back to sort of its founding in 1988, really was that multicultural institution in which various ethnic groups and their contributions to Western history sat alongside one another. You know, that was reflected in the community gallery, in which you have the case for the Chinese American experience and the Mexican American experience and the Native American experience. Increasingly, I think the museum has begun to recognize and sort of taking down many of those case walls and barriers, not only, and this is where I think the Western and the hemispheric and geographical or geopolitical nature of the museum's mission actually benefits its interpretive process, is that we have always had an emphasis on the West as a prism, not just for the American experience, but for the global experience and the global reach of the American West and the various people who have shaped it. And this benefits our approach increasingly, I think, to the Native collections as we start to look at those, not just as a collection of one body of people, but of course, it's really an international one in and of itself. So there is a globalism that we can apply to Native collections, even within the boundaries of the continental US, because of the sheer volume of diversity and sovereignty represented therein. So with this, you know, those kinds of approaches have long, I think, encouraged our curatorial staff to think not in terms of fixed borders, but in terms of their crossing, their migration, and their sort of evaporation when it comes to how culture is produced and reproduced by people of various groups and sort of the spaces in between those voices. So the messiness, in other words, that often comes from encounters, historic and contemporary, violent and peaceful, as intracultural dynamics, is born of intercultural dynamics, as you say. One of the ways in which I think, you know, this has informed a physical, you know, gallery and curatorial experience or visitor experience, one of the ways in which I hope it sort of gets to that introspection within the individual who comes through our doors, is the placement, the relatively recent placement of that towering Rose Simpson sculpture, aptly titled "Witness," and it, you know, over the Thomas Moran's Mountain of the Holy Cross, which is perhaps, you know, many, and for obvious reasons, one of the sort of the premier expressions of you know, manifest destiny, is a sort of a divine ordinance. Anyway, it's the dialogue. Those two objects are, of course, significant, spectacular, and amazing on their own terms for a variety of reasons, aesthetic and technical, historic, and otherwise. But it is in playing off one another, and in standing between them with the gaze of the witness barreling down on the Mountain of the Holy Cross, which is some 150 years its senior, almost in many ways. With this sort of, it's not necessarily quizzical, it's not necessarily critical, but it is speculative, I think, sort of nature to its gaze that embodies or enacts, brings life to that interrelational sort of messiness in a profound way that is still, I don't know, it
No,
really just animated the whole space when we brought that in.
I agree with that. I agree with what it did for that space too. But just pulling together what I think both you and Kevin are saying, which I think is really important for purposes of today's discussion. Having been a failed graduate student who sort of left that field and went on to law school because there wasn't enough revolution going on in the American History Department at Harvard on these kinds of questions. I think the wisest thing I ever heard a historian say is that history is inherently messy, and anybody who thinks otherwise is deluding himself or herself. And so I think that it's interesting for museums to try to take on that messiness, and we make a contribution in doing so. By simply admitting that it's messy. And to Kevin's point about in the Americans saying, well, we sort of didn't know why this was being said either, quite frankly. We're sort of all in this big gray area, is much more akin to how history and art that speaks to history is really happening than these sort of pristine, very vertical boundaries that we put up between this community and that community, their art and that community's art. It's a much better way of doing things. That brings me to the question, and I guess we need to begin moving along a little bit. I want to get a notion, first of all, here are two things I'd like to discuss before we have to sign off for the day. One is what all of this has to do with this sense of connection between community and the museum as an institution. And how, if you have that kind of connection, it begins to suggest questions or answers to questions about the nature of museums in the 21st century, as opposed to the 20th century, or certainly the 19th. And there are reference points in what the good Secretary Adams said when he said we're no longer the temple on the hill. We've talked a little bit about that and why this inclusion of other authoritative voices and voices worth collaborating with is important. But what, Kevin, let me ask you first, what does all of this have to do, and the shift of power which has occurred in museums, what does that have to do with relationships, first of all, with Native communities themselves? Let me ask you that. And then Amy, sort of broadening that, taking it beyond Native communities in an intercultural institution like the Autry. What does that mean in terms of the nature of a museum in the 21st century as connective tissue with communities it purports to serve? So Kevin, let me begin with you and then we'll shift to Amy.
Well, it's really everything. I mean, you cannot credibly represent a particular culture, whether through its art, through its music. You can't represent it without hearing the voice and presenting the voice of the community itself. And what's really important, and part of what we're driving at, is the communities demand it now, and they're going to become more vociferous. They're going to become more urgent in their demands that they be heard. And we see this in a number of ways. One is, in the news every day, some museum is returning some item or object or precious thing, whether to an Indian tribe or to a particular community within the US or even internationally. But we also see it and the museum world has responded nicely to all the concerns about diversity. And in fact, I think the museum world is really leading there. But that's not, if we were left to our own devices, perhaps that would not be so urgent. But what we're seeing is that people to whom we owe responsibilities are insisting that our collections be more representative of either the local community or the nation at large. And so we see more and more efforts to diversify collections, diversify staff, diversify content, and it's existential. I think it's obvious that if we don't do that, museums will become irrelevant to too much of the public, and without the public support, we can't continue to exist. So it really this idea of sharing authority, being accountable in the community is absolutely essential. And because we're no longer the temple, it's no longer build it and they will come. We've got to show that that we have something that they will enjoy and find a way to make these institutions important to them.
Right. Let me ask one follow-on question to that, Kevin, and that is to your reflection, since at one time there was actually a department, it was one of the four major departments of the museum of community services, or community and constituent services. Mm-hmm. Turn that around and tell me for a moment what that may suggest in terms of community connections that the NMAI brings directly to Indian country, as opposed to making sure that they feel a presence in our places in Washington, D.C. and New York. How does that work out?
Yeah, well, we did have a Department of Community and Constituent Services, and it was, but the whole idea of constituent service, of service to the communities, was so deeply embedded. I said, we don't need a separate staff to do that. That is everybody's job at this museum. It's my job, it's the conservator's job, it's the exhibition staff's job. So let's not have it be a department. That is essentially who we are. And I think it takes its clearest form now in a project that the NMAI is doing to share their collections with tribal museums. One of the great moments in my time at the NMAI was early on, when I got to go visit a bunch of tribal museums. And I was really struck because some of them were quite modest, some of them were very, very nice, but they were being authentic in a way that we could not be in Washington, D.C. and New York. We, by simple geography, we could not be as authentic as they were in their own homes, telling their own story. And that was very important to me. So part of what the NMAI has been doing over the years is trying to empower those museums and send as much of these collections as we can for them to have. And we call them loans, but we're perfectly understanding that we're unlikely ever to have those objects back in Washington again, and that they really are where they belong. And it hasn't disabled the museum in any significant way. Rick West famously said at one point in the midst of the repatriation discussion that the NMAI had repatriated some 2,000 items by this time. And Rick said, and so we'll have to just get by with 798,000 items that we have left in our collection. And that's really true. Even as we're making loans of 100, 200, 300 objects to these tribal museums, we still have plenty. Yeah. We still have plenty to show and plenty to do. So that's where I think that's where the idea of community service and constituent service is leading. That's certainly where it's led the NMAI.
Yeah, and I think it recognizes a very important truth, and that is that we, NMAI, is an institution that deals with living cultures. the source communities are still among us. They will insist on being so. And quite frankly, those cultures are not given real breath and life in Washington, D.C. or New York. It is indeed in the geographies where those communities are located. And I think this was a recognition of that. And as I recall, it, for a while at least, it was referred to as the fourth museum. And I think it is aptly so. Amy, your perspectives on that and the work that we do, and I would invite your specific focus on one that you and I, an exhibit of yours that you and I know and love very much, La Raza, and how that was so connected with community in a very contemporary kind of way. A historic event which probably is 3 generations old, and was not remembered by the grandchildren as vividly as it was remembered by the grandparents, and how this exhibit sort of redid the binding, if you will, on that connective tissue.
Right. So I agree with everything Kevin said about getting back into, and I have some thoughts on that as well. But what La Raza did, which was a photographic exhibition of Chicano activist photojournalism, so artists as both agents and activists of social change in the context of Chicano era Los Angeles, and the photographic archive of some 25,000 images that was produced for La Raza magazine, one of its main sort of mouthpieces. And that exhibition curated again thematically around the issues that matter to the activists, and the role of photography and art in articulating and broadcasting those issues was how it was organized. In concert with one of the photographers themselves as a co-curator, and with the photographic, and with the rest of the photographers also, who came in and informed not only what the images were and what they represented, not unlike the Southwest Museum, many of them were mislabeled and incorrectly identified. So it was their role in both shaping the actual contents of the archive, as well as animating it when it was there installed. And that was a conversation between the curators, the photographers, and other aspects of museum staff, including exhibition designers, who blew up certain images, giving certain people and protesters sort of a monumental dimension, I think, within the show. Videos and an interactive database that allowed anybody to search the entire archive and cross-reference it by artist, by date, by individual historical figures, geographies within Los Angeles, things like that. So there were multiple interactive components. There were multiple moments of collaboration, consultation, and knowledge sharing within the exhibition. And most importantly, I think when that all really sort of came together in the gallery space, we had, for the first time in the Autry, large groups of young brown teenagers, many of them from the very high schools that had launched the Chicano movement with the East LA walkouts of 1968, pointing, talking, and engaging with the images and with each other. And in many ways, I think La Raza, for all of those reasons, embodied the museum as a contact zone, not just between individuals and art and imagery that may be on the walls, but between one another and their own sense of history, and their place within the museum. It literally, visually, and physically placed young brown people on the gallery walls in ways that was inherently relatable to their successors, many of whom were the heirs of the gains made by the people represented in the show, and also still very much tied to the ongoing sort of struggles and recognition that the project is not done. So museum is contact zone between community and art, between different members of the community, between the museum staff and members of the community, and the conversations that came out of that were just thrilling to watch. I loved the most rewarding thing of the entire La Raza project was after it was all up on the walls and going into the gallery and just sort of quietly watching a packed gallery filled with young people engaged with images of themselves, basically, on the walls. The thing that we need to do still and ongoing is the continuation of those relationships and the building of trust, because those relationships need trust and ongoing cultivation really to matter, I think, ultimately. And that's a process that is often difficult for museums to sort of complete or continue. And then I think the other thing, which was alluding somewhat to, or speaks somewhat to what Kevin was also saying, is not just expecting those audiences, whether they are Native American or Latinx, to come into the museum, which is still technically the museum's sort of authoritative turf, but to spend more time in the communities and to send museum knowledge, collections, experiences out back and into those non-traditional spaces. So it becomes the two-way sharing of knowledge that we now recognize benefits us both, is extended to geography rather than just the museum itself.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that we are winding down to a close. Let me just make a couple of observations before we go. And first of all, I want to thank you, Amy, and you, Kevin, for joining this conversation today. I have worked with both of you at great length, have enjoyed all of it, believe me, wish you both well in what you are doing now, while I finally enjoy at age 80 retirement. So I will go on my way and you will go on your ways. I think what I distill from virtually everything we have said is a transformation, if you will, of the museum, going from the 19th and the 20th to the 21st, which was referred to by Bob Adams in the statement that he made. It really is something that we have to take in, and it is that museums in this day and age, and for reasons certainly contemporary, and pressures on museums need to think of themselves not just as houses of objects. That was certainly true with the NMAI, but it's true of all museums. It's not that they are not houses of objects, they are, but they are something in addition to that. And Bob Adams referred to that. They are forms, they're civic space, they are social place, they are gathering. It is the abundance of authoritative and authentic voices who are permitted to join that space that strengthens them as institutions, and that strengthens their connective tissue with the communities they purport to serve. And God knows that this country, and the world for that matter, are looking for that kind of space at the present time, since lots of the institutions relied upon historically to create these gathering spaces for civil discourse seem to be in a state of collapse or rigidity that makes them really not very useful sometimes. Museums can't do everything, but they should do something to try to contribute to the reinstitution, if you will, of civil discourse over very tough issues. So I leave you with these words of the poet, Simon Ortiz, the Pueblo of Acoma in New Mexico. It's a little poem called It Doesn't End, of Course. And it goes, it doesn't end, of course, in all growing from all earths to all skies, in all touching all things, in all soothing the aches of all years. It doesn't end. In the context of Simon, he was talking about his own identity and heritage as a Native person. I think it can be taken beyond the Native community to be talking about American society. It will serve us all, and it will empower museums if they can realize that we will be a far stronger society and better built for the future if we can embrace that concept of including all voices in a civil setting where all can be heard, and trying to empower community connection through the vehicle called the museum. Again, thanks so much for your time and for joining us today.